And if you know me, you know that I do. I think there are always going to be moments where you feel as though a story is being told about some caricature of you that actually has nothing to do with you.
At exactly 7:32 this morning, December 2nd, Buckingham Palace dropped a statement so stark, so final, that even veteran royal correspondents found themselves rereading it not once, but twice, unsure they were reading it right. The palace confirmed that all future coordination with the Duchess of Sussex had officially been concluded. 16 words that landed like frost on glass, brittle, sharp, unforgiving, the announcement that changed everything in an instant. The notification came without ceremony, without the usual diplomatic cushioning that softens royal decisions, leaving the world to absorb it raw. It first appeared as a bulletin on the palace's official communications channel before rippling across every major network. Within minutes, BBC interrupted its morning programming. Sky News pulled analysts from their desks, and across the Atlantic in the United States, where dawn had barely broken on the East Coast, anchors scrambled to process a statement that read, less like clarification and more like severance. What made the moment so chilling wasn't simply the content, it was the tone. Royal statements usually carry layers of softness, phrases like mutual understanding or continued respect. This one carried none of that. It was clean. Surgical, absolute, the kind of language reserved for moments when an institution reaches the end of negotiation and moves into permanent territory, beyond compromise, outside the walls of Kensington Palace. The December morning air hung cold and still. A handful of reporters, gathered for what they expected to be routine coverage, suddenly realized they were in the middle of a breaking story. One journalist, a woman who had spent nearly 20 years covering the royals, pressed her phone to her ear and whispered to a colleague, "They've actually done it! They've drawn the line inside the palace walls!" The atmosphere inside the palace was equally taut. Senior staff moved through their morning routines with a strange mix of relief and apprehension. Relief, because a decision debated, delayed, and agonized over for months had finally been made. Apprehension, because once a statement like this goes public, there's no turning back. The Crown had spoken, and across the Atlantic, the Crown does not retract. The reaction was immediate and visceral. American morning shows devoted entire segments to parsing every single word. Commentators noted the absence of any mention of reconciliation, any suggestion of dialogue, none. One analyst on CBS described it as the coldest official distancing the monarchy had issued since the abdication crisis. Another on CNN pointed out the timing, just as the holiday season approached, which sent a clear, unmistakable message. This was not a pause. This was the end. For those who had followed the Sussex saga from the start, the announcement felt both shocking and inevitable. Shocking because, despite years of tension, many believed the palace would leave a door slightly ajar. Inevitable because the warning signs had been building for months, visible to anyone paying close attention. And now, on this December morning, the door hadn't just closed. It had been locked from the inside, decisively, permanently. So, what exactly forced the palace to take such a bold step? What pressures, missteps, and confrontations pushed the monarchy to a point where silence was no longer an option? Stay with me, because the story behind this morning's announcement is far more layered, far more deliberate, and far more consequential than those 16 words ever reveal. The months leading to this moment were filled with tension, strategy, and careful calculation. To understand why the palace moved with such decisiveness on December 2nd, we must go back to the quieter months that preceded it, months in which small fractures widened, tensions deepened, and the royal family found themselves navigating an increasingly untenable situation. This announcement didn't arrive suddenly. It was built slowly, carefully, through a series of events that made today's decision not just possible, but necessary, almost inevitable. Throughout the autumn of 2024, King Charles faced mounting pressures. His health, though carefully managed and rarely discussed, required a lighter schedule than originally planned. Palaces adjusted his engagements, citing the need to preserve his energy for constitutional duties. This increased the burden on Prince William, who was already balancing state obligations, a young family, and the growing responsibilities of his role as heir apparent. William had always approached his duties with measured seriousness, But by late September, those close to him noticed a change. He grew more guarded, more deliberate in public statements, and far less willing to entertain conversations about reconciliation with the Sussex. It wasn't anger driving this shift. It was something colder, a recognition that the institution he would one day lead could not continue absorbing disruption without consequence. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Every few weeks, a new narrative surfaced, sometimes in American media, sometimes through carefully placed interviews, sometimes via social media channels with timing that seemed coordinated. The stories varied, but the effect was always the same. They pulled focus away from the working royals, reignited old controversies, and forced the palace into reactive mode. Princess Catherine, who had spent years cultivating a reputation grounded in steadiness and service, found herself increasingly drawn into these swirling narratives. Unnamed sources suggested tension between her and Meghan. Reports surfaced claiming internal conflicts over charitable initiatives. Speculation about her health, schedule, and private life swirled like wildfire. Most of it was untrue, yet all of it was exhausting. Inside Kensington Palace, William watched his wife navigate this storm with grace, but he also saw the toll it took. Catherine rarely complained. She continued raising their children, supporting her causes, and maintaining a dignity that made criticism look petty in comparison. But William knew better than anyone that silence should never be mistaken for acceptance. He was no longer willing to let his family serve as collateral damage in someone else's narrative strategy. By mid-November, palace communications teams began tracking a troubling trend. Multiple American outlets were running stories based on palace sources that didn't exist. These phantom sources claimed knowledge of private discussions, personal frustrations, and upcoming announcements. None of it was accurate, but the sheer volume of misinformation created a cloud of confusion that hovered over every legitimate royal engagement, complicating schedules, appearances, and public perception. Even the Foreign Office quietly expressed concern. Diplomatic partners in Washington, Ottawa, and Canberra asked whether the Crown would address the Sussex situation more directly. The questions were carefully phrased, but the implication was unmistakable. The ongoing instability was starting to complicate relationships that depended on clarity and consistency. And then there was Queen Camilla. She had spent decades rebuilding her reputation and understood better than anyone how dangerous uncontrolled narratives could become. She had survived public storms before and knew how quickly perception could harden into permanent judgment. She feared that allowing the current cycle to continue would destabilize not only Charles, but the institution itself, threatening the careful balance of tradition, public trust, and royal authority that had taken decades to restore. In private conversations with William and Anne, Camilla expressed a view that surprised some who heard it. She believed that protecting Meghan from criticism had become secondary to protecting the monarchy from chaos. It was not malice that drove her words, it was survival. Institutions, she noted, cannot function when every week brings a fresh crisis, manufactured from fragments of half-truths, whispers, and strategic leaks designed to unsettle stability. As November deepened and December approached, the palace found itself at a crossroads. Continue absorbing each wave of speculation and controversy, reacting endlessly, or act decisively. Draw a line and end the uncertainty once and for all. The choice, though painful, was becoming impossible to ignore. The shift from caution to action didn't happen overnight. It unfolded through 5 unmistakable warning signs, each one escalating in severity, each one nudging the palace closer to the decision announced this morning. For those inside the royal household, ignoring them was no longer an option. The first warning appeared in late October during a private briefing Catherine received at Kensington Palace. She was reviewing her winter schedule when a senior communications advisor presented a disturbing pattern. Over 6 weeks, more than a dozen articles across American media suggested friction between Catherine and senior palace staff. The language was strikingly similar in every piece, the timelines vague, the sources always described as close to the royal household. Catherine recognized the tactic immediately. These were not independent reports. They were coordinated talking points, strategically released to manufacture the impression of internal dysfunction. And whether intentional or not, they were designed to undermine her credibility during a period when her public profile was growing stronger than ever. What troubled her most wasn't the content. She had grown used to false narratives. It was the timing. Each article coincided with her major announcements about early childhood initiatives, as if someone was deliberately trying to dilute positive coverage with manufactured controversy. When she brought this to William, his expression hardened. He had suspected coordination for months. Now he had confirmation. The second warning arrived through Princess Anne. In early November, Anne was reviewing international press coverage when something peculiar caught her eye. Several high-profile American journalists had begun citing Buckingham Palace sources about the Sussex. The problem? None of these reporters had clearance, and the information contradicted official palace positions. Anne, who had spent decades upholding royal protocol, immediately flagged the discrepancy. A quiet investigation revealed the sources weren't palace officials. They were individuals formerly connected to Meghan's team, now presenting themselves as insiders. The deception was brazen, and Anne knew it crossed a line. She brought her findings directly to Charles, calm but firm. This is not gossip. This is deliberate misrepresentation. The third warning came from an unexpected source, the Foreign Office. Through discreet channels, diplomats informed the palace that renewed Sussex-related media cycles were creating complications abroad. Partners in North America voiced frustration. Every royal visit, state function, or diplomatic engagement seemed overshadowed by questions about internal family dynamics. One senior diplomat said bluntly, "We cannot maintain the gravitas needed for serious international relationships when public conversation keeps circling back to who said what to whom." 5 years ago, such a message would have been shocking. Now, the monarchy's inability to resolve the Sussex situation was no longer just a family issue. It had become a governance issue. The fourth warning accelerated everything. In mid-November, palace legal teams learned that a major documentary company was developing a project centered on Meghan's royal experience. The proposal, leaked through intermediaries, planned a year-end release designed to coincide with the Christmas season. It would feature new interviews, revisit old grievances, and frame Meghan's departure as institutional failure rather than personal choice. William reviewed the proposal with barely concealed frustration. The timing was not accidental. Christmas was the monarchy's most symbolically important season, a time when tradition, family, and continuity mattered more than controversy. Launching a documentary designed to reignite conflict during that period was, in his eyes, a calculated provocation meant to disrupt the stability he and Catherine had worked to protect. The fifth and final warning came when Camilla, in a rare moment of complete alignment with William and Anne, voiced her concern at Clarence House. She had been reviewing public sentiment data showing that older audiences, particularly in the United States, were growing weary of the endless Sussex narrative. Polling indicated that while sympathy for Meghan remained in some groups, a significant portion of the public, especially those over 50, believed the monarchy had been patient enough. Camilla's voice was calm, steady, but urgent. "If we allow this to continue into the new year," she said, "we risk losing the moral authority we need to lead. Charles cannot endure another season of this. The family cannot endure it, and the institution will not survive it." Her words carried the weight of someone who understood intimately what it meant to rebuild after public condemnation. She was making it clear that the time for patience had passed, the time for boundaries had arrived. By the final week of November, the warning signs were no longer subtle, they were glaring. For William, who would one day carry the crown, the decision became unavoidable. Action was no longer optional. The breaking point arrived on the evening of November 30th, inside the 1844 room at Buckingham Palace. The room, steeped in history and reserved for delicate discussions, felt colder than usual. Outside, winter rain tapped relentlessly against tall windows, while the faint glow of palace lights barely penetrated the December darkness. William arrived first, carrying a folder of documents, communication summaries, media analyses, legal briefings, and Foreign Office correspondence. Each page represented another fracture, another reason why the situation could no longer be managed quietly. He sat at the head of the table, composed but tense, the weight of what was about to unfold pressing down. Moments later, Princess Anne entered. Her presence was steady as ever. She nodded once to William, then took her seat without ceremony, her position already clear. In previous discussions, she had made it known that the institution could not afford another year of reactive crisis management. Boundaries had to be drawn. and they had to hold. Queen Camilla arrived moments later, wrapped in a dark winter coat. Her face balanced concern with resolve. She understood the emotional cost of the conversation about to unfold, but she also understood the necessity. Charles's health, the monarchy's stability, and the family's cohesion all depended on ending the cycle of disruption that had dominated the past year. When the private secretary closed the doors, the room fell silent. William spoke first, his voice steady but deliberate. "Before we proceed," he said quietly, "I want it understood that this decision concerns the future of the crown, not personal grievances." It was a deliberate framing, designed to strip emotion from a conversation that could have easily spiraled into bitterness. He slid forward a stack of documents, each page heavy with consequence. "These," Camilla said, "detail the coordinated media efforts we have tracked over the past 4 months. The pattern is unmistakable. Someone is actively working to destabilize our public narrative, and the evidence points consistently in one direction." Her voice was low but certain. "Your father cannot carry another season of this. He barely recovered from the last cycle. If we allow this documentary to launch at Christmas, it will consume everything we have worked to rebuild." William reviewed the materials again, though he had already memorized every detail. The false palace sources, the coordinated attacks on Catherine, the diplomatic complications, the documentary proposal, timed for maximum impact during the holiday season. Each piece on its own might have been manageable. Together, they formed a picture that could no longer be ignored. A senior legal advisor presented the final analysis. Under current circumstances, the Crown had 3 options: continue as before, absorbing each new wave of controversy; issue a private warning through intermediaries which carried no guarantee of compliance; or make a public statement drawing a definitive boundary. The first option preserved short-term peace, but guaranteed long-term instability. The second invited further testing of limits. The third ended ambiguity entirely. The room fell silent again. William looked at Anne, then Camilla, then down at the papers before him. He understood what the third option meant. It meant publicly severing coordination with Meghan. It meant accepting that reconciliation, at least in any formal sense, was no longer possible. It meant choosing the institution over the individual, and doing so in a way that could not be misinterpreted or softened later. The weight of the decision pressed down like the cold December air outside the palace walls. "William, you know what must be done," Camilla said, leaning slightly forward. "If we do not act now, we will face this same conversation again in 3 months, then again in 6. The pattern will not stop unless we stop it." Her tone was firm but measured. "The statement does not need to be cruel. It simply needs to be clear. We are not attacking anyone. We are protecting something." William exhaled slowly. "Then we proceed," he said. "The statement must be final, unambiguous, and released before the documentary proposal gains further traction. No half measures, no room for reinterpretation." Drafting began immediately. Senior communications staff worked through the night, testing language, refining tone, ensuring every word carried institutional authority without tipping into personal condemnation. William rejected multiple drafts, too vague, too harsh, too apologetic. He wanted precision. He wanted finality. He wanted the world to understand that this decision, however difficult, was irreversible by dawn on December 2nd. The final draft was complete. 16 words that would reshape the monarchy's relationship with the Duchess of Sussex forever. As staff prepared for release, William stood alone in the dim light of the 1844 room, aware that in a few hours the world would understand what the palace had chosen: stability over sentiment, clarity over chaos, the future over the past. At 7:32 on the morning of December 2nd, the statement went live. First on the palace's official communications platform, a single sentence, stark against a white background, carried everything. "The palace confirms that all future coordination with the Duchess of Sussex has been formally concluded." No explanation, no context, no softening, just 16 words that landed with the force of a closing door. Within 60 seconds, notifications exploded across newsrooms worldwide. BBC interrupted its morning broadcast. Sky News scrambled its royal correspondents. ITV pulled analysts from their desks. On social media, the announcement spread with a speed that even seasoned palace staff found astonishing. What made it devastating wasn't only what it said, but what it refused to say. There was no mention of continued respect. no acknowledgement of shared history, no hint that circumstances might change in the future. The palace had chosen language designed to communicate one thing, and one thing only. This chapter is over. In California, where dawn had not yet broken, the notification reached Harry and Meghan's home shortly after 4 in the morning. Sources close to the couple described the reaction as stunned silence. Harry, who had spent years navigating the impossible space between loyalty to his wife and connection to his family, reportedly stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone down without a word. Meghan's response, according to those nearby, was quieter but no less profound. She had prepared herself for many outcomes: a private warning, a request for dialogue, or even a public rebuke framed with diplomatic language. But this, a formal conclusion of coordination, delivered without preamble or explanation, felt like something else entirely. It felt like erasure. Back in London, the palace braced for the inevitable storm. Communications teams fielded urgent calls from journalists demanding clarification. Legal advisors reviewed the statement's implications for future interactions. Security teams assessed whether additional measures were needed. And senior royals, having made the decision collectively, now faced the task of defending it publicly through their silence. Princess Anne resumed her scheduled engagements with characteristic composure. Those who observed her that day noted her steady demeanour, as if the morning's announcement had been nothing more than routine business. But those closest to her understood the truth. Anne had pushed for this decision longer than anyone. Now that it had been made, she felt a grim satisfaction that the institution had finally chosen discipline over accommodation. William appeared briefly at a public event later that morning. He offered no comment on the statement. He didn't need to. His calm, unwavering presence communicated everything the palace wanted the world to know. The decision was final. The monarchy was moving forward. There would be no further discussion. Catherine, meanwhile, continued her work with the same grace that had defined her public life. She did not address the announcement. She did not react to the inevitable speculation. She simply carried on, embodying the quiet strength that made the palace's decision seem not only necessary, but overdue. The fallout came quickly. In the hours following the announcement, the world revealed itself divided, not by borders, but by perspective. In the United Kingdom, especially among viewers over 50, the reaction was largely one of relief. Finally, many said, the palace had drawn a line. Radio call-in shows were flooded with messages of support, noting that the monarchy had been patient far longer than most institutions would have been. British newspapers, historically cautious about pushing too hard on the Sussex, now felt emboldened. Editorials praised the palace for choosing stability over ongoing disruption. The Times analysed the decision as a necessary evolution in royal crisis management. Even outlets previously sympathetic to Meghan acknowledged that the endless disruptions had become untenable. In the United States, however, the reaction split sharply along generational and cultural lines. Older viewers, particularly those who remembered the Diana years, tended to view the announcement as harsh but understandable. Younger audiences, attuned to social media narratives, debated its fairness and tone. The palace, aware of this divide, remained unmoved. The focus was not popularity, it was clarity, authority, and protection of the institution. They recognized the institutional pressures the palace faced and appreciated the clarity of the decision, even if they felt personal sympathy for Meghan. Younger audiences, especially those who had followed her journey from the beginning, reacted with anger and disbelief. Social media erupted with accusations of institutional cruelty, racism, and abandonment. Hashtags demanding accountability trended for hours, flooding feeds worldwide. Think pieces appeared across digital outlets, questioning whether the monarchy had truly learned from past mistakes. Inside Buckingham Palace, staff experienced a strange mix of relief and tension. Relief, certainly, that a lingering source of uncertainty had finally been resolved, but apprehension lingered over what might come next. Meghan had remained largely silent in recent months, but silence, they knew, could be temporary. A woman with nothing left to lose, and a global platform at her disposal, was not someone the palace could afford to underestimate. Legal teams immediately began preparing for multiple scenarios: a public response, a media interview, a book, a documentary, or any combination of actions that could unfold unpredictably. Despite the palace's statement, each possibility carried risk. Each required careful contingency planning. The line had been drawn, but defending it would require vigilance and strategy. For the broader royal family, the decision brought a kind of weary unity. Charles, though emotionally pained by the finality of it all, understood that the institution he had inherited could not survive another year of reactive chaos. William and Catherine, relieved to have clarity at last, refocused their energy on the future they were building for their children. And Anne, ever the pragmatist, simply moved forward, secure in the knowledge that the Crown had chosen survival over sentiment. As the winter sun set over London on December 2nd, the shock of the morning's announcement began settling into something quieter, but still profound. A truth emerged that reached far beyond palace walls. This was not simply a story about royalty and protocol. It was a story about boundaries, consequences, and the painful clarity that only arrives when all other options have been exhausted. For Meghan, today's announcement represented something profoundly difficult, not merely a loss of formal connection to the institution she once married into, but a confirmation that the bridge she may have hoped still existed had been permanently closed. That is a hard truth to absorb, especially for someone who has spent years navigating the impossible space between public expectation and personal authenticity. Yet a lesson resonates beyond the specifics of royal drama. Institutions, whether monarchies, families, or organizations, cannot function indefinitely in a state of unresolved tension. At some point, clarity becomes more valuable than hope, boundaries become more protective than patience, and difficult decisions, however painful, become the only path toward stability. From my own perspective, watching this unfold, I found myself reflecting on how often we encounter similar crossroads in our own lives. The relationships that cannot be repaired, the partnerships that no longer serve anyone well, the situations that demand a choice not because we want to choose, but because continuing without clarity has become more harmful than any definitive answer could ever be. The palace's decision was not made lightly. It was not made in anger. It was made after months of escalating pressure, institutional strain, and the sober recognition that protecting the future sometimes requires letting go of the past. That is a truth many of us, especially those who have faced our own impossible choices, understand intimately. For William, this moment represented both an ending and a beginning, an ending to years of reactive crisis management, a beginning of a new chapter where the Crown's priorities are defined not by external disruption, but by internal purpose. He chose the path of clarity, even knowing it came with emotional cost, a choice that, difficult as it was, reflected the kind of leadership his future role would demand. For Charles, the decision carried a different weight. He has spent his entire life balancing personal feeling with institutional duty, and today, once again, duty prevailed. It is a burden every monarch understands, but understanding does not make it lighter. As we close this chapter, one question lingers in the December air. What comes next? Will Meghan respond publicly? Will the silence hold? Will this truly be the final word, or simply the opening of another quieter conflict? The palace has spoken, the boundary has been drawn, and the monarchy, battered but upright, has chosen its future. Whether that future holds peace or merely a different kind of storm remains to be seen. But for now, on this cold December morning, one truth stands clear. Sometimes, the most compassionate thing an institution can do is stop pretending the past can be recovered and start building something new from what remains. As the lights dim over Buckingham Palace tonight and the December chill settles deeper into the stone corridors, the story we have witnessed today is not truly an ending. It is a pause, a breath before whatever comes next. The palace has spoken with a finality that cannot be undone. Meghan must now navigate a future without the institution she once belonged to, and the monarchy must prove that the boundary it drew today was worth the cost. This moment will inevitably resonate for those of us watching from afar. The lesson remains achingly simple. Closure, however harsh, is sometimes the only mercy left when every softer option has been exhausted. Institutions survive not by clinging to what was, but by choosing what must be. Families, royal or otherwise, endure, not because they avoid difficult truths, but because they eventually find the courage to speak them aloud. If you are watching this story unfold from anywhere in the world, I would be honored to know your thoughts. Share your perspective, leave a comment, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story. Your voice, wherever you are, adds depth to how we all understand what happened on this cold December morning when the Crown finally chose its future.